Tom Paris's 20th century obsession in Star Trek. Voyager makes more sense now than it did in 1995. When Star Trek Voyager premiered in 1995, Tom Paris immediately stood out as one of the more unusual Starfleet officers. While his crewmates were preoccupied with science, exploration, or Klingon honor, Paris had a very different passion. The late 20th century. From his fascination with 1960s cars and classic rock to his love of black and white movies and his design of the Delta Flyer based on old hot rod aesthetics, Paris's obsession was played partly for humor and partly as character color. At the time, some fans rolled their eyes at Paris's retro fixation. Why would a man living in the 24th century, surrounded by warp cores, holodecks, and replicators, be enamored with such a specific and, from his perspective, ancient period of history? For many in the 1990s, it seemed more like a way for the writers to insert familiar cultural references into Voyager rather than a natural character trait. But nearly 30 years later, Paris's obsession makes far more sense, both within the context of Star Trek storytelling and in light of how modern audiences understand nostalgia, identity, and the longing for connection to a past we never experienced. Nostalgia as a defining human trait. The first clue to why Tom Paris's obsession resonates more today is the evolving cultural understanding of nostalgia. In the mid-1990s, nostalgia was often treated as kitschy, reruns of old shows, vintage collectibles, or a quirky personality trait. Today, nostalgia is recognized as a powerful force in entertainment, consumer culture, and even mental health. Streaming platforms thrive on rebooting beloved franchises. Retro gaming is bigger than ever. Vinyl records outsell CDs. People spend countless hours diving into eras they never personally lived through, whether it's the 1980s mall aesthetic or the smoky jazz clubs of the 1940s. For many, this backward gaze is less about the era itself and more about what the era represents: comfort, identity, or a window into a less complicated world. Tom Paris, in this light, becomes less of a quirky character and more of a cultural foreigner. He's the guy who curated his own identity through a specific historical fixation, much in the same way modern fans with their love of Stranger Things, 1990s anime, or vintage fashion as badges of personal expression. Part childhood and rebellion. There's also the personal dimension. Paris's strained relationship with his father, Admiral Owen Paris, defined much of his early life. As a young man desperate to escape the shadow of Starfleet expectations, Tom's obsession with 20th century culture may have been a way of carving out individuality. Unlike the uniformity of Starfleet life, the 20th century, especially post-World War II America, was seen as messy, colorful, rebellious, and freewheeling. Hot rods weren't about efficiency, they were about expression. Drive-in movies weren't about technological progress, they were about romance and escapism. For someone like Paris, who grew up suffocated by rules and duty, this retro fixation was both rebellion and therapy. What looked like kitsch in 1995 now reads as a deeply human response to pressure. Just as people today seek comfort in childhood cartoons, Paris found freedom in imagining himself behind the wheel of a 1969 Camaro instead of the helm of a starship. Voyager's isolation amplified it. Another reason Paris's obsession makes more sense today is the context of Voyager's journey. Stranded 70,000 light years from home, the crew clung to anything that reminded them of Earth. Neelix cooked comfort foods, Janeway clung to the protocols of Starfleet, and Paris buried himself in the 20th century. Seen this way, his obsession was more than hobby, it was survival. The holodeck programs of Captain Proton and old race cars weren't trivial distractions, they were lifelines to normalcy. By recreating 20th century settings, Paris wasn't just indulging in nerdy fandom, he was giving himself and his crewmates a way to feel anchored to home in the most alienating circumstances imaginable. Modern audiences, having lived through years of global isolation during the pandemic, may find this especially relatable. Like Paris, many turn to nostalgic media, revisiting childhood shows, movies, or hobbies because they provided comfort when the outside world felt uncertain. Voyager's predicament, once abstract, now mirrors a reality millions experienced. The meta angle, Star Trek's relationship with the 20th century. Another layer worth considering is how Star Trek itself has always used 20th century culture as shorthand for human identity. Captain Kirk played poker and quoted Dickens. Picard loved Shakespeare. Dixon Hill novels, and jazz. Siskel was passionate about baseball. Each of these 24th century characters grounded themselves in ancient culture. But Tom Paris's version of this tradition is uniquely American and uniquely populist. Where Picard's Shakespeare love reflects refinement, Paris's interest in cars and B-movies reflects the ordinary. He doesn't just love history, he loves pop culture, the stuff that rarely makes it into the history books but defines how people actually lived. Looking at it today, Paris's obsession feels ahead of its time because modern culture places enormous value on pop nostalgia. People dissect old sitcoms on YouTube, analyze forgotten commercials, and restore retro arcades. Paris wasn't just a character quirk, he was embodying the shift from great man history to everyday culture. The Captain Proton phenomenon. Perhaps the best example of how Paris's obsession matured is the Captain Proton holodeck program. On the surface, it's silly, a black and white homage to 1930s sci-fi serials, complete with overacting, cheesy villains, and papier-match rocket ships. In the 1990s, it played like comic relief. But in hindsight, Captain Proton was genius. It gave Voyager one of its most distinct recurring holodeck settings, and it allowed the crew to play in a sandbox that was fun, theatrical, and very human. More importantly, it showed how shared nostalgia could bond people together. Harry, Kim, and Paris weren't just running programs, they were building friendship through fandom. Even Janeway, reluctantly, stepped into the role of Arachnia, Queen of the Spider People. This mirrors how, in the real world, communal nostalgia, fandom conventions, retro watch parties, cosplay, creates bonds across very different people. Captain Proton wasn't trivial at all, it was community. Why it resonates more in 2025. Rewatching Voyager today, Paris's obsession no longer feels like a writer's gimmick. It feels authentic. We live in a time when pop culture defines identity, where the internet allows people to immerse themselves in eras they never lived, and where nostalgia is a dominant cultural currency. Tom Paris is, in many ways, the most modern character on Voyager. He represents how people use the past to shape their sense of self in the present. His obsession with 20th century culture is a reminder that history is not just dates and battles, it's the everyday joys, aesthetics, and passions that make life worth living. A final thought. Back in 1995, Tom Paris's obsession may have seemed odd, maybe even shallow compared to the grand ideals of Star Trek. But now, his character feels strikingly prescient. He showed that in the face of duty, trauma, and isolation, clinging to old passions isn't a weakness, it's a form of resilience. Just as Voyager's crew held on to their humanity by remembering Earth, Paris kept himself whole by diving into an era that symbolized freedom, rebellion, and identity. Today, when so many of us turn to the past to make sense of the present, Paris doesn't just make sense. He feels like one of the most relatable characters Star Trek ever gave us. Would you like me to expand this into a slightly more episode-focused analysis citing specific Voyager moments like Threshold, 30 Days, or Night to ground Paris's obsession in concrete canon examples? The past to make sense of the present. Paris doesn't just make sense. He feels like one of the most relatable characters Star Trek ever gave us. Would you like me to expand this into a slightly more episode-focused analysis citing specific Voyager moments? Lee Day,